whittled down the wide planks for the back. This is for the wide cabinet. Each of these is about 9 1/4 inch wide. I was able to get about 3/8 of thickness, and they're nice and flat. So now I need to joint the edges to book match the two pieces. And since the fence is never completely 90 degrees square, what I do is I joint one edge with the face into the fence. I joint the adjoining edge with the face out from the fence. And that way, if there's a little bit of off, if the angle is a little bit off on the fence, the two will complement each other, and I'll end up with an actual flat joint once it's glued up. The glue up is straightforward with the freshly jointed edge, and I squared the opposite sides so they'd rest nice and evenly on the clamp faces. I'm just going to go ahead and use a little Titebond 3. Spread it nice and evenly. Want to get good contact. And then I'm doing my glue up on a couple of 2x blocks to keep the work elevator away from the clamp bars. Clamp bars have a tendency to bend a little bit, and that can put a little bend in the joint. Don't want that. Get the line up about right, and then just slowly start to bring the clamps home. Then I turn upside down, just in case those faces flex a little bit. This will even it out so that the work won't flex. Okay, and then I got to get rid of the excess glue. Use a credit card. Just scrape it off. And scrape that off as well. Now, to get these panels flat and remove the little glue line that I have, I'm using the drum sander. I don't want to use a planer for this because I don't want to chip out any of this nice grain. So if I just gently sand it, we'll get there. All of these vertical frame parts have to be the same length, 66 1/2 inches. So what I've done is I've set up a block on my sander as a stop. And so each of these pieces, I've already squared the ends. So each of these pieces I can just butt up the squared end to the block and go ahead and saw it, and I'll have the same length. I can run through all 24 of these. Well, now I'm going to do the joinery for the corners of the doors and the sides and the back frames. And so I'll start with the rails. Those are the horizontal parts of all those frames. And the way I like to make rails is I want to put the mortises in the rails so that they, when you look at face on, they're extending full width. So I've set up my tenoning jig with my blade to cut to the right 1.25 inch height, and I've made marked lines here for where the mortises have to go. I spent some extra time really tightening up this jig to make sure it's as accurate as possible, because with these very long doors, these are 66 1/2 inch doors, just a little bit of error here is going to translate to a big error on the door flatness, and so I want to get them as good as I can. So we're all set. I've got a backing block clamped here to make sure there's no blowout. Here's my first rail lined up and everything, ready to go. Okay, and so I've cut right up to the line. Looks good on both sides. All I've got to do is flip this over, do the other side, do that with all the pieces, and I'm done. I've got all the mortises cut. Now it's time to cut the tenons, and that's a little more difficult. A lot of trial and error. I had to start with the cut wide and then ease my way in until I could get it perfect. So I've got a pretty good fit now. Now I'm cutting off the waste here for the cheeks of the tenons. I've adjusted a block and clamped it to my saw fence guide, just the right depth so that when I make the cutoff, I'll be exactly the thickness of my rails. And I've adjusted the saw height to be perfect. And I've done a few test cuts, and I get these little square chips. There we get a good fit. It's important to have your block, your stop block, somewhere other than next to the saw blade, because you wouldn't want to have your stop block up here, run your work through, and then have this little chip try to jam between the blade and the block. It'll come flying out with tremendous force. So set your block up somewhere else so that your work is free once it's going through the blade, and the piece can just drop off. On the frames for the backs, I'm installing a mid-level rail here so that the panels are not full height. I've learned by experience that very high panels, if they warp a little bit, there's just nothing to support them and they can pop out of the side grooves. So by putting that mid-rail in there, I give it a little more support if it does tend to bow some. So I've made those rails, and I'm just going to domino them in place. So I've already cut one domino mortise here. I'll do the same thing in the ends of these. I'm all set up to cut. And that will take a 6mm by 40mm domino, which will be plenty for holding this in place. In order to cut the domino mortise in the ends of these rails, I use an attachment on the domino machine that you can adjust these side fences in so that the machine fits right over the work. All you got to do is make sure that your fences are really centered properly, and you could just do 100 of these things. It's important also to make sure you know what top is, because you want to make sure that the vertical position of the bit is the same on the stiles and the rails. There we go. Now I'm cutting the grooves in the frame so that the panels will fit in, and I'm using a 1/4 inch cutter, 5/16 deep, and the cutter approximately lines up with the open mortises, but not perfectly. So I've done a couple of things to make sure this works right. First of all, I marked every piece with the top reference face so that if the bit is a little bit high or low, all the pieces will be the same. The panel will fit in correctly. Secondly, I've got a feather board here to help hold the work down solidly to the table, so that, again, we're referencing the back of the work to the table, and everything will, all the pieces will turn out the same. Now when I ran these panels through the shaper to give me the correct thickness of the tongue, the cutters weren't set exactly, so I have to take off a little more material. So to do that, I'm using a skew, low angle skew block plane. This cutting's out of here. It's got an iron that is flush with the edge and a fence that I can adjust. So I've adjusted this fence to the 5/16 of an inch, and the iron is just barely protruding. First thing I'll do is use my knife marking gauge to scribe a line on this cross-cut grain so I don't tear out any of the fibers. So I'll just run a couple of passes to cut the fibers, because I'm not taking off much. Make sure I'm all tight here. I am. Just make a couple of passes here. And then do a test fit with one of the pieces that I cut. Okay, that's not bad. I might take off another pass, but you get the idea. That brings it right in where I need it. Following the sanding with the Rotex sander, I went to 320 grit. Now I've put on a coat of 1 pound cut shellac. That's 1 pound of flakes per gallon of denatured alcohol. I did that both sides, then I hand sanded to 320 again. I'm going to do my second coat, and then I'll hand sand to 400, and we'll do that until the surface feels nice and smooth. And you kind of know when you're there. The surface feels good, but the shellac doesn't ball up on the sandpaper continuously. So I'm just going to take a piece of cotton that I folded up, just carefully spread the shellac, nice even coat. Well, here's the glue up of the panels. They've all been shellacked, all the parts. I've extended my clamps, these Bessie K-body clamps, using these extension pieces. It ties 2 clamps together at the end. And then I clamp the edges, the actual open mortise and tenon joints shut, and that's where the real clamping power comes in after I've got it squared up. Well, these are the 4 finished back panels. I think they turned out pretty well. We got pretty good grain matches between the 2 panels. You can see, hopefully you can see where the dark lines and so forth match up well, so that's real good. The next step is to work on the sides and the doors, which will have glass.